Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hybrid workplace webinar. I'm going to give everybody a minute to join and then we'll go ahead and get started. Great, I guess we'll go ahead and jump in. We're right at 10 a.m. So we are on time. We're really excited to have all of our existing customers as well as many new faces here today. We really hope that you find value in today's webinar. I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping items before we begin. Throughout the presentation, we'll have a few polls that we encourage you to participate in. If you have any thoughts throughout the presentation, please utilize the question feature or the chat within GoToWebinar. We have set aside a few minutes at the conclusion of the webinar to go over any questions. We have also provided a few handouts that you can access that provide further information on FSi Strategies, Andy Nelson's full bio, as well as 2 case studies that may give further education around some of the topics we'll be covering today. Your presenter today is Andy Nelson. Andy is the Vice President of Microsoft Technology Strategy at FSi. Andy has earned over 30 Microsoft certifications and has been consulting on Microsoft technologies for over 13 years. Thank you for joining us today, Andy.
Thanks, Ryan. Happy to be here, and thanks for that introduction. So as Ryan said, I'm Andy Nelson, FSi's Vice President of Microsoft Technology Strategy. And I know a number of you watching today have been working with FSi already for a number of years, but we've also got some people here who haven't yet met us. So for those of you who aren't yet familiar with FSi, FSi is an 18-and-a-half-year-old Microsoft consulting partner and IT managed service provider focused on helping companies accomplish their business goals through technology. And today we're going to be talking about the hybrid workplace. So first, we'll level set and get on the same page by defining the hybrid workplace, explain the long-running trends driving that change and the role the pandemic played in that, the good and the bad that come along with hybrid work, and then 6 key areas to target so that you can build a plan to prepare for that hybrid workplace experience, taking advantage of the good and minimizing the bad. But first, let's just do a quick poll. Where's everyone watching this from right now? Where are you working from today? Okay, so it looks like we got a myriad of responses there, people attending from different locations. So what is the hybrid workplace? As simple as we can make it, work can either be done from the office or remotely from out of the office. A hybrid workplace leverages both. So anytime we talk about hybrid workplace, hybrid organization, hybrid model, it very simply means an organization taking advantage of both employees working in the office and employees working remotely. As that strategy has evolved over the years, we've seen it present itself in 2 key ways. The first is where some staff work in the office and some people work remotely, but there's no overlap. You're either a remote person or an in-office person, not both. So there's a hybrid of both models at the organizational level, but not for the individual. The second, and what is much more relevant now, is that where the flexibility is extended down to the individual, where staff can work in the office sometimes, remotely other times, and switch back and forth as needed. So let's take another poll from the audience. Which model best describes your organization before the pandemic? So were you primarily in the office, full remote, a hybrid model without flexibility, or hybrid with flexibility? Okay, looks like we had quite a few actually have a flexible workplace even prior to the pandemic, and then quite a few others that were still primarily in office. So if we look at what led to that transformation, that's kind of right on par with how this has evolved. The pandemic did force everyone to start working from home, but really this is a transformation that's been in progress for years prior to that, fueled by two primary business drivers. The first was the desire to increase business continuity without increasing costs. And that was enabled by the cloud, and the increasing ubiquity of the internet just made it more accessible. Couple that with a new generation of millennials entering the workforce. Oh, whoops, pardon me, slides moving too quickly. So if we couple that desire to increase business continuity through the cloud with a new generation of millennials entering the workforce that were really the first born in the cloud generation. Their entire life was online. Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, swipe right for a date. They were able to adopt technology extremely quicker than any other generation before them in the marketplace. And they were really able to get more done on a phone than most before them could get done on a computer. What organizations saw was with the millennials and Gen Z coming behind them, they were going to find a way to do things their way with or without the organization providing the tools. And if they did it without organizational tools, that's going to be through their personal accounts like Gmail, Dropbox, Google Drive, and that brings with it a slew of governance, compliance, and security concerns. So that led to the second major driver, which was the desire to empower staff to be productive from anywhere on any device to support the new way that that younger generation was working without losing governance of your data or exposing yourself to unnecessary security risk. So when you're looking at the bigger picture, you start to see that the pandemic didn't really drive this at the core. What it did was accelerate it for some of us that weren't prepared for remote work. This pushed us further along the journey. The reason that's important to note is that what this means is when the pandemic is over, this is not going away. It's not stopping, it's not moving backwards. This trend will only accelerate after the pandemic. So what do we do with that information? Let's go over what it brings with it, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and that will frame what we're trying to accentuate and what we're trying to avoid through those 6 key areas when we build our plan. So here's the good. Flexibility to work in the office or remote adds a layer of business continuity in the event that you can't work from the office. So think events like snowstorms, power outages, global pandemics, and improves work-life balance at the individual level. Think sick child, for example. And this flexibility is so important for that younger generation we're talking about that 69% of millennials would actually give up some of their existing or additional benefits for a more flexible workspace. They'd actually give up some of their benefits for that flexibility. Individuals having control over their environment ends up resulting in more productive employees. So you can expect to see a productivity increase. In fact, 77% of information workers are more productive from home than they are in the office, and 75% choose working remotely specifically because they can reduce distractions more effectively remotely than they can in the office. On average, people who work remotely contribute an average of 1.4 more days of work per month. And a study from Stanford University showed that companies that allowed flexible work showed an increased profitability of $2,000 per employee on average. So you can see some real increased efficiency. And these are data-driven statistics. But with that said, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. There are some drawbacks that we know we can expect to encounter, and we need to plan for those appropriately. So here's what we can expect to see on the negative side of the coin. So first of all, you're going to lose some visibility and governance. Not only do you lose literal visibility to oversee how people are doing, we can also lose visibility over how staff are accessing corporate data. Are they using their corporate devices? Are they using personal devices? What about how they're connecting? Are their internet connections secure at home? In addition to that, stress can build up. You definitely can reduce stress by eliminating the commute, right? That's better. But we know that remote staff are more susceptible to stress, more susceptible to stress through isolation and technology fatigue. So virtual meetings are shown to be more psychologically taxing than in-person communication. And although we've talked about work-life balance as a benefit to flexibility, 22% of remote workers said they had trouble unplugging after work. And if we're not careful to disconnect at some point, the lines between work and life can become blurred. And as Satya Nadella put it, you don't know if you're working from home or sleeping at work. And finally, communication, collaboration, connection. There are a few ways that you could describe this, but we lose the many coincidental interactions at work, the water cooler effect, basically, of conversations that we're included in just by nature of being in the office. An even larger problem we're seeing is that the communication channel can get severed at the office border, especially if we're using different tools in the office and remotely. That is a recipe for a bifurcated communication channel. You really have to get everyone on the same platform, whether they're in the office or out of the office, for all forms of communication: phone, chat, email, video, files, and that even includes figuring out how to handle old-fashioned stand-up announcements that otherwise wouldn't make them their way out of the office, and getting everyone off of personal messengers like GChat, for example, onto a single organizationally governed platform like Teams, for example. Okay, let's do another quick poll. How do you feel about going to the office to see your coworkers? Is this something that you'd never do again if you didn't have to, or do you get some benefit out of that? Okay, so we had an overwhelming response that most people would like to do both, but work remotely most of the time. So this is a great segue into our next topic, which is what I see as the single most dangerous pitfall that you really need to avoid. This is not only the easiest to run into we've seen, it is the most negatively impactful, and that is second-class citizen syndrome. It's affecting millions of people around the world. Where it comes from is that we're used to working in the office, so that becomes our baseline that everything else gets compared to naturally. So when we're entirely remote, as most of us have shifted to now, although there's differences in how we have to work now, everyone is subject to those differences at the same time. So we're all in the same boat when everyone is remote. With some people in the office and some people remote, remote staff become out of sight, out of mind. So there becomes a natural preference developed for those people that are in the office. And not only does that lead to 57% of remote staff feeling disconnected from the rest of the organization, without deliberate intervention, staff become disproportionately favored. And studies actually show that remote staff in a hybrid model become favored, are favored over by their in-office counterparts 62% of the time for career growth opportunities. That same proportion of remote staff also feel that they are lacking networking opportunities that would be beneficial to their career that their in-office counterparts get to take advantage of. So this is a very serious issue. It's the easiest one to run into in a hybrid model, and I don't want it to turn into an epidemic for you. So as we're building our plan to enable a flexible hybrid workplace, we want to focus on each of these 6 key areas and how we can use these to empower staff to be successful and build in support where we know that they're likely to struggle. especially around that second-class citizen syndrome, since we know that's so easy to fall into and so dangerous. So the first thing we want to do is define our strategy. That's going to shape each of the other pillars. We need to define our business strategy. In other words, what are you trying to accomplish with a flexible hybrid workplace? For example, are you trying to expand geographically into other markets and support them through the use of remote staff, or perhaps not expand into other markets, but maybe explore hiring remote staff to expand your talent pool, perhaps into areas with lower cost of living. You also need to define your IT strategy to support each of your defined goals in the flexible workplace, so you can provide the same experience whether you're in the office or out of the office, securely with governance over your data regardless of the device. A key theme that you're going to hear me talk about as we go through each one of these key areas is the same experience in the office or out of the office. That's absolutely critical to avoiding second-class citizen syndrome. Next, let's take a closer look at the digital transformation. That's obviously what's supporting the ability for us to go remote and, as we return to the office, to support a flexible hybrid environment. But is there a way that we can use part of this digital transformation to more directly accelerate how you deliver your product, service, or mission? For example, using virtual meetings with donors or customers. There's a great case study on a bike shop that prior to the pandemic made a good chunk of their revenue off of accessory sales when someone would bring their bike into the shop to get advice from the experts on staff. They obviously lost that source of revenue during the pandemic, but by pivoting and offering virtual visits and consultations, they were able to offer that service to anyone around the world and then drive online sales rather than in-store sales. And that actually increased their market dramatically because now they weren't limited to the customers that could walk or bike or drive their bike into the store. It was anyone with a bike that could connect with them virtually. And next, in your strategy, you want to plan how you're going to roll out the changes and keep them up to date. That's what we've seen make these changes successful in the long run and stick. Rather than roll them out all at once, what we've seen having success is using a change team to collect feedback, rolling out pilot programs for each department, collecting that feedback, and applying lessons learned across the organization. Once you've got your strategy defined, policies are how you can set boundaries on how much flexibility should be taken advantage of and establish the standard operating procedures that are going to drive behavior changes. If we don't use policies to do this, people are going to work the way they're used to working. And while we all did learn how to work remotely during the pandemic, when we go back in the office, we may not have had experience previously with working with remote coworkers or flexible coworkers that are in some days, out some days. So we really need to lean on policy to drive that behavior change initially and make sure that we're not going to create an environment where the remote staff are left out from opportunity or opportunity to advance or opportunity to participate. Once you put these policies in place, then you can use your change team that you put together to make sure that the policies are actually being followed, identify what's working, what isn't, and where you need to make changes. You can find out if a policy is not being followed, what is at the heart of that? Is it because it's too difficult and cumbersome? People don't understand the new directions or have clear access to them? Or is there some other driver that you need to identify so you can address there? So one key thing to keep in mind it is unlikely that you'll be able to take your existing policies, your existing standard operating procedures, and just modify them to add components that account for remote work. That is basically a recipe for second-class citizen syndrome, because what you'll be doing is taking a set of in-office policies that weren't designed to support collaboration between in-office staff and remote staff, and then adding on a category for the remote staff. So you're really driving the in-office staff to continue working amongst themselves and the remote staff to work remotely. So that would be a big pitfall to fall into second-class citizen syndrome. As we're rethinking these, here are some critical areas that you'll want to target policies around. The first is obviously schedules and flexibility. So we're opening up this possibility of the flexibility to work in the office and out of the office. And with that, we've also seen a flexibility in when people are getting work done when they're working remotely. So that needs to be addressed for each role, team, and department in your organization to define what opportunities are there to improve those roles by taking advantage of one of the models, and what limitations need to be put in place. So for example, does everyone on a specific team need to be working at the same time, or can that work be done asynchronously without collaborating with others? Are there specific roles where you need to ensure that a minimum number of people are online at the same time, or that a certain number of people are on site at any given time? For example, if someone on a team needs to receive packages at the office, that team needs to ensure that they have someone on site for those days. And then the core of the rest of the policies are really going to focus around creating a parity experience, whether you're in the office or out of the office. So I put 3 key areas that will support this here: onboarding, meetings, and equipment. So how can we make sure that remote staff are getting the same quality onboarding experience as in-office staff? So some organizations are bringing people on site in the office for the first week, even if they're going to be working remotely for permanently or for extended durations after that. They can be brought in for a hotel for a week. Others are doing things like mailing welcome kits and materials and scheduling frequent video check-ins for the first few weeks to make sure that remote employee gets onboarded and acquainted well. And one key thing to note when you're onboarding staff, if you're enabling a flexible workplace and giving people the choice to work in the office or remotely, even the staff that are working in the office, if they're in the office for their first few days onboarding, that doesn't mean that they don't necessarily need training on how to work remotely. They themselves may work remotely soon, and even if they don't, they'll be working with remote coworkers. So it's really important that both groups, whether they're working remotely or working in the office, are onboarded from a perspective of working in the office and working remotely and collaborating across boundaries. Meetings are a huge difference maker in a hybrid workplace, especially for second-class citizen syndrome. You absolutely need to get everyone on the same experience in the office or out of the office, and meetings is a big differentiator for that. One of the reasons is because in the office, we all go into a conference room. You can't do that remotely. So what we need to do is ensure that conference rooms and other team spaces are hybrid ready. You can use they're going to need to have a camera for video and a big screen so that the people in the office can see the remote staff clearly. The camera should be a room system camera that's designed to film the entire room so remote staff can see everyone in the room and tell who's talking. If you're using Microsoft 365, Teams Room Systems is a platform you're using to do that. If you're using Zoom for meetings, you would use a Zoom room system. You also need to make sure that not just the meeting spaces, but that all the meetings themselves can support someone joining remotely. So if you're using the Microsoft platform, you can enable a setting that will ensure that every calendar invitation has remote capability through the Teams platform in it. that's a no-brainer to deploy if you're using Teams for your meeting platform. If you're using Zoom or another video platform, you can look into if you can enable that through the technology, and if not, you'll need to put a policy in place to enforce when remote capability needs to be added into a meeting. Ideally, you want that every time. You want every meeting to allow participation from people in the office and out of the office. You're also going to get some other questions that will come up now that we're doing virtual meetings, like, are you going to have a dress code for virtual meetings? You know, not everyone dresses up at home. My team looks at me like I'm crazy. Personally, for me, this helps me be more productive if I dress the same, whether I'm in the office or out of the office. So this works for me, but not every organization requires that. Some have more laxed policies. You may decide to have a different policy for customer-facing calls versus internal calls. What I do recommend, though, regardless of how you want to establish your dress code, is that you standardize around turning video on in every meeting. Studies show that video communication is significantly more effective than verbal communication only, especially more than written communication. And in addition to that, it's helpful to be able to see each other. That's something that we get in the office, that people that you may not actually be working directly with, you still see them and understand who they are. And that connection is lost when we're working remotely. So using the policy is one way that we can lean on that to ensure people are changing that behavior. So even remote staff get to see in-office staff, and in-office staff are seeing remote staff. If you find that people are uncomfortable with video, what I've found is that it's not a level of discomfort from being seen. Because if you think about it, when we walk into a physical conference room, we're being seen then too. What can make people uncomfortable is if they're preoccupied with how they look on video. And that comes from the video preview. By seeing that video preview, you're hyper aware of how you look. If people are uncomfortable, have them minimize that preview. I know you can do that in Teams. If you're using another video platform, see if you can minimize the preview, and that should take people's focus off of themselves so they can focus on who they're talking with. And then finally, you need to make sure everyone is set up with the right equipment so that they can take advantage of the technology that we're deploying. So first, they need a video capable device. Whether you're using BYOD as your strategy or you're providing corporate devices, pretty much any modern laptop has a video device that will be sufficient. But what you often will need to supplement is an audio device. So I'm using an in-ear device. There are other styles like on-desk speakerphones, physical handsets, and then over-the-head headphones. Whatever you use, make sure that it is certified for the conferencing platform that you're using. So if you're using Teams, it would be a certified for Microsoft Teams device. Microsoft makes that easy. They have a list of them on their website. So if it's not on the Microsoft website, it's not officially certified for Microsoft Teams. If you use one of those compared to a consumer device, let's say like Apple AirPods, you'll notice the difference immediately. Whether you're a technology guru or not, it's a night and day difference. And that's critical to ensuring the same experience in the office and out of the office. The next place where equipment becomes vitally important is in conference rooms and team spaces. All the conference rooms and shared spaces need to be video and hybrid ready with high resolution cameras that can show the entire in-office group to everyone that's remote, and large screens so that everyone in the conference room physically can see everyone clearly that's attending remotely. If you're using Teams room systems make that very easy to accomplish by taking the guesswork out of the components. If you're using Zoom, Zoom has a similar equivalent called a Zoom room system. And if you're using another video platform, check with that platform's manufacturer to see if they have a room system component. So after we've establish our policies, that's what we're going to lean on to set boundaries and then drive behavior change. The next area we want to focus on is your organizational culture. This is one of the most important aspects of your company because it's the values you operate by. It is difficult to preserve when you are shifting from in the office to remote or flexible, because these are values that aren't typically absorbed by being dictated what they are. They're absorbed by experiencing them, by seeing them being lived out. So first and foremost, communication has to be done through the same tools in the office and out of the office. If people in the office are communicating on a platform that remote staff don't have access to, they're obviously not going to get that message, and that culture is not going to be relayed to them. That's a recipe for second-class citizen syndrome. You need to make sure everyone's on the same tools, and that includes email, phone, video, and chat. If people are using personal instant messengers, we need to stop doing that. We need to get everyone on an organizational governed messenger that you can ensure in-office staff can use and remote staff can use. If you're using Microsoft 365, Teams would be the messenger you would use. You also want to make sure that you have an asynchronous platform for communication like Teams or Slack if you're not on the Microsoft platform. An asynchronous platform allows people to communicate across boundaries and physical locations and across time zones. So what it enables at its core is someone can participate in the conversation now, and then I can receive that later without being there and add to the conversation at a different time without having been there at the original location or the original time. And I've mentioned it pretty much in each of our other pillars. You absolutely have to use video. FSi, one way that we do this to get everyone seeing each other, whether we're in the office or not, is on our monthly staff meeting, we all use video. We're not all speaking, 90% of us on the staff meeting aren't speaking at all. But we all use video to see each other and replicate that in-office experience. And it allows us to build that connection, preserve that sense of culture. And then when we do go in the office, we know who people are. Some additional strategies that you can use to foster that sense of culture are using a buddy system. You can pair employees with each other, whether that's across boundaries, pairing in-office staff with remote staff, pairing flexible staff together, or pairing remote staff together. That gives people a lifeline. It gives someone else, someone that they can reach out to if they're stressed, if they have a question. And you can build in deliberate interactions on what the buddies should do. You can give them a project to work on together, or just schedule check-ins for them to make sure that neither are being left out on an island. You can also build into your standard operating procedures regular video meetings as one-on-ones between managers and their direct reports, or as group calls between teams, just to make sure even if a status update isn't needed on that project, you can have a regularly scheduled call with the team just so everyone sees each other. That is going to help facilitate the connection between people, preserve your culture, and ensure that we don't have people drifting into that second-class citizen syndrome. A great strategy that you can use to preserve culture and transfer culture across the divide between remote staff and in-office staff is through a digital break room. So if we're in the office, we have all those coincidental opportunities for interaction with our coworkers at the water cooler, in the hallway, or just overhearing conversations around us, or when we jump into the break room. You can recreate that break room environment for remote staff with a digital break room. You can set up a Teams meeting or a Zoom meeting and have people jump in when they need to take a break between switching from tasks or to eat lunch in there. You can take that a step further and bridge the in-office staff with the remote staff by making that digital break room a hybrid break room, where you can set up the online meeting so that remote staff can join and put that online meeting up on one of the room systems in one of your conference rooms or team spaces, so that not only can remote staff jump in this virtual break room, they won't only be talking with remote staff in there, in-office staff can jump in the physical conference room and have a break with other in-office staff or with staff that are working remotely that day. Okay, so before I dive into the next pillar, which is technology, let's do a quick poll. In your estimation, what was your organization's level of readiness for remote work before the pandemic? Would you say you weren't ready and working remotely was either not possible or not practicable? You had some capability, but were lacking quite a bit. You were almost ready, or you were ready and you could do everything you needed to from home from a technology perspective, just needed to change the business processes around it. Okay, this is probably our most diverse poll yet. We have a very even spread across those. So we can see people are at different places in this journey. So not everyone's plan is going to look exactly the same, but this is something that you can revisit whether or not you've already crossed that bridge. What we're seeing being really effective right now is that in the world of hybrid, all companies have to be digital companies. Your technology strategy has to be at the center of that. And while working remotely at the start of the pandemic, while that shift forced many of us to deploy some solutions quickly to enable that, we're seeing a lot of organizations take this opportunity to reassess what they've deployed and take inventory of whether or not this is the best solution for them or if it was just what they could do quickly. So they can reassess if what they're doing makes the most sense for them in terms of productivity, effectiveness, cost effectiveness, and security. So with that said, technology is really fueling all of the transformational changes we're talking about. But here are some key areas where if you haven't invested yet, these are key areas that you'll need to be prepared to invest in order to enable an effective and paired experience, whether staff are in the office or remotely. Number one is you need to have a unified experience. So that's the parity that I'm talking about. The experience has to be the same in the office and out of the office. And to accomplish that, it's essential that you have tools, that you have the same tool set to accomplish communication in the office and out of the office. If you're on Microsoft 365, that's relatively easy to accomplish. You can use OneDrive and SharePoint for files. Teams can take care of chat, meetings, video, and even phones. And then you can use Intune to do device management. If you're using another platform, you may have to use a few solutions to support all of those workloads. But if you look to cloud solutions first, that will give you the best chance of being able to support the same experience in the office and out of the office. Next thing to consider, absolutely have to use video. You've heard me say that over and over, and that's because it's important. In the office, people can see each other when they talk to each other, so we have to enable that if we don't want to have second-class citizens. So they need to be able to talk to remote staff that way and in-office staff. To make sure that people can do that effectively, you've got to provide the right tools to get the job done. And so that means tools for individuals like the audio devices we talked about, as well as making sure that your conference rooms are equipped to support a hybrid working environment with people joining the meeting in the office as well as out of the office. And of course, if we can't do this securely, everything we've done might as well be for naught. So you need insight into BYOD devices as well as corporate devices, how they're accessing your data, and the ability to set security standards you require, the ability to check your compliance in real time and enforce changes if necessary. If you're using Microsoft 365, the technology that can enable all of those features is called Intune. You can set the standards for whether a corporate or BYOD device needs to access any of your corporate data. And if it doesn't meet those standards, you can either reject it or apply those standards to the device, whether that device be a smartphone or a laptop or a desktop or a tablet. And then finally, you need to have a plan on how you're going to support the technology for your staff, especially when they're working remote. Technology is their lifeline. How are you going to support them? Is that a role that you're going to fill internally, or are you leveraging a partner for that? Whichever model you're using, staff need to know who they can reach out to for help. And what organizations that have been successful in this have been doing is, instead of waiting for staff to reach out, especially when they're new or just adopting one of these new ways of working, having people proactively reach out to individuals to see if they need help. "57% of remote staff felt disconnected from the rest of the organization while they were working remotely." So the key to facilitating connection in a hybrid model is making sure that you can create parity between the in-office experience and the remote experience. Video is absolutely key to that. Like the example I mentioned before, we make sure that we are all on video at least once a month for our staff meeting, but we also have regular video meetings with the people that we're more closely engaged with on our individual teams, daily, weekly, many times a day. Everyone at FSi is on video for scheduled calls and ad hoc calls. When you first adopt a new model like this, you may want to implement policies to facilitate random check-ins between people who may be working on the same team or maybe working on other teams, like that buddy system approach we've talked about. One of the major things you lose when moving from office work to remote work are those coincidental interactions that you get, the water cooler effect when you're in the office. So we need to find ways that we can build those in to our remote work lifestyle. A great way to do that is to try to bring the remote experience to life in the office. So if you have staff that are working remotely, either full-time permanently or for extended periods of time, you can create a station for them in the office with a camera and a monitor so that they can, from that station, see the other people in the physical office around that area, and so that other people in that area can see, hear, and communicate with that person just as if they were sitting at a desk. When I initially started working with full-time remote staff, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, that was one of the key strategies we used to be able to have effective blended teams between in-office staff and remote staff. Another great way that you can build that connection is by assigning group projects. You can use group projects for work that would have previously done by an individual on a team. You can add a few people onto that project, divide the work, and then make sure that they are meeting about it at regular intervals. That will give them a chance to use video and get that connection. But you can also assign group projects for no other reason than the purpose of facilitating connection. That gives you the opportunity to connect people that wouldn't have otherwise worked together. And what that does is that replicates the experience of the people you can run into in the office that aren't part of projects you're working on or the teams that you work directly as a part of. These connection-based group projects that maybe just meet maybe an hour or half an hour a week, for example, give people a chance to connect with those that they wouldn't otherwise work with. At FSi, one way we do this is we have a diversity inclusion initiative. Everyone that is part of the diversity inclusion project meets bi-weekly in a video call to discuss our progress, and then we break out into smaller groups that meet in between. And many of the people in those groups are people that otherwise wouldn't work together at all. And finally, training. Training is the glue that's going to hold this together. Strategy is going to define where you're going and what you want to accomplish. Policies are going to change the behavior, but training is going to be necessary in more than one of these areas to make this work. And one thing to note, training is not something that you're going to flip a switch and do once at the start of something. You're going to need to think of training now as more like a continuing education process. New staff are going to need it, existing staff are going to need it, and everyone is going to need refreshers along the way, especially as your organization evolves and the technology evolves with it. It really helps adoption if the managers and the leaders, whether those are peer group leaders or organizational leaders, adopt the technology first, can vouch for it, and are able to answer questions. So what we've seen being effective is managers getting training first so that they can disseminate information from the top down, put the stamp on it, and so that they can answer questions quickly when people have them. And in addition to that, not just people that are organizational direct reports, if you can identify people that are looked up to as peer leaders that are using the technology effective, those are your champions. You can take those people who are excelling, give them credit for it, and then put some responsibility on them to continue championing that technology and become a resource for their peers. It's additionally very helpful if you take those champions and then give them a platform on your asynchronous chat-based workspace. So if you're on the Microsoft platform, that'd be a Teams channel. If you're using Slack, that'd be a Slack workspace. And that will allow people to ask questions of the champions. The champions can participate and respond, and everyone can benefit from those questions and answers, whether they were there for the meeting, in the office, working on A shift, B shift, or all of the above. And then finally, if you see something that is outside of how you had scoped the technology to be used, but it's working effectively, spotlight that, have that individual do a training on it, and find out how you can adopt that and build it into your policies and framework so you can benefit from it over and over again. Okay, so in conclusion, we've seen a significant transformation driving the hybrid workplace, one that was in motion before the pandemic, and it's going to continue after the pandemic. While the benefits of flexible work are backed up with significant data-driven research, it's critical that we avoid the most common pitfall, which is second-class citizen syndrome. We avoid that primarily by ensuring that we are delivering a unified experience on a unified platform and tool set for staff that are in the office and working remotely. To build that plan, focus on these 6 areas: defining your strategy, using your policies to set boundaries and change behavior, and then leveraging technology and your technology strategy to foster culture, build connection, and use training to make sure that everyone understands all of the above, that they understand the policies on what they're supposed to do, what your organizational values are and how you're driving them, and how to use the technology. So now we will open it up to questions.
Andy, that was great. Thank you very much.
Sure, thanks, Ryan.
And we had a very active audience, which I very much appreciate. You guys kept me busy. Let me see here. I have a few questions for you, Andy. I am going to start with one came in that asked, how do you deal with break rooms and meeting fatigue? And before you answer that, Andy, I just want to state we have about 11 minutes left. So if we do not get to your question, I will make sure we address it via email with you. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to us directly and we'd be happy to have a discussion. So again, Andy, that question is, how do you deal with break rooms and meeting fatigue?
Great question. Meeting fatigue is real. We know that virtual meetings are psychologically more taxing. One way that we've seen organizations targeting that is with policies like no meeting Fridays, right? just completely cutting them out of the loop. Another is shortening meetings. If you're using Microsoft 365, you can, at the individual level through your personal Outlook settings, or organizationally, you can roll this out where meetings are by default shortened. So if you schedule a 30-minute meeting, it actually shortens it to 25 minutes by default. And if you schedule an hour meeting, it shortens it to 10 minutes by default. Having that little break, even if it's just 5 minutes for a half an hour or 10 minutes for an hour, that gives people a chance to reset, step away from the technology, let some of that stress go. You still need to provide guidance on strategies to mitigate that stress, but having the breaks between meetings prevents them from going back to back to back, and that stress compounding all the way through. In terms of break rooms, strive to have a hybrid environment for every environment that you have. So if it's a digital break room, see how you can tie that into one of your in-office working spaces. And if it's a conference room or another team space in the office, use a room system to enable remote staff to join. So if you're using the Microsoft platform, a Teams room system is what would enable that. If you're using Zoom, it would be a Zoom room system to do that. So I think that answered your question, but if it doesn't, on my bio slide, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. So if it isn't, just submit it again and we'll get it answered.
Yeah, and you can find Andy's bio in the handouts. There's actually a few handouts there that you might find useful. So I have a couple more, Andy. So can you comment on how the hybrid workplace is important to get right in terms of retention and recruitment?
Absolutely. About 75, it's somewhere around 75 or 76% of employees said that a flexible workplace would cause them to consider not leaving an organization they would have otherwise considered leaving. So it has a lot to do with employee retention in terms of a benefit. And remember, we also had that statistic that 69% of millennials would sacrifice some of their existing benefits to get a flexible workplace. So it's a very attractive employee benefit. The other side of how it benefits you from a talent and recruiting perspective is by broadening your talent pool. With flexible work, you now may be able to hire people that if they only have to commute once a week, they would have previously considered your organization out of reach for them, but maybe it's tolerable for them now. Additionally, if you're open to full-time remote staff, that significantly opens up the geographic boundaries of where you can hire.
Great, thanks, Andy. I have another one here. So how do you tackle the asynchronous scheduling for deadline-based projects?
Yeah.
One of the comments here is, I could see issues coming from not setting a standard office hour period for last-minute requests and projects.
Yeah, absolutely. That depends on the role, the team, and the department, right? Not every team is going to be set up ideally, or it's not complete asynchronous work is not going to be ideal for every team, right? Even though the flexibility of it would be great for those teams that need to have a certain amount of quorum really online at the same time, you need to put guidelines around that. So it could be, you can do your work on your asynchronous schedule, but between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. Eastern time, we need you there at least 4 hours of your work between that time frame. Some teams and roles are going to be right to have more flexibility. Others will need to have more boundaries around them. So I recommend using a change team or a change committee and then doing a pilot with that team, collecting feedback and seeing what works and what doesn't.
Great, thanks, Andy.
Sure.
One that I particularly liked that came in was the personal background for employees. There's a personal issue there, right? The visibility of home environments, et cetera. Is there a way around that? Is there a way to put up a background?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. The short answer is there really isn't a way around it. Just like when you're in the office, everyone has an environment there too. You have your work area, and each organization has standards on what's appropriate to show in your work area, how neat you have to make it. I recently personally made a change along with our organizational initiative to when I'm doing any collaboration or video meetings, I work from this setup that I have here rather than the office that I have set up around the corner in my den there, because that room looks like a dungeon and it's not very inviting. And this one has much better lighting. People can see me much more naturally. And I generally have a clean background behind me. It's up to your organization, if you want to make a standard, northwindtraders.com or Acme background. I have personally found that I feel like I'm connecting more authentically with the person I'm talking to if I'm not using a virtual background. So I personally don't use a virtual one, but that's I think personal preference.
Great, thanks for that. And we have, so I had one come in that says, we're fully hybrid. Are there any new digital tools that we may be interested in that are coming out in the coming months or that are out now that are vital to the ongoing shift?
Yeah, great question. There are always going to be new tools coming out. I don't know what you're already using, but 90% of the organizations I work with haven't yet maximized how much they're capitalizing on their existing technology, either how much of it they've deployed, enabled, or how much they're using in their business processes. So I would say your highest return on investment for lowest effort is going to be examining how you're using what you have now before looking to add solutions onto that. The priority I would put on a technology overhaul would be getting onto a single platform that enables all of the productivity and collaboration you need. So Microsoft 365 is the one that I've been helping organizations work with over the past 13 years. And that can cover all of your productivity solutions like email, team and personal files, chat-based workspace, instant messaging, phone, online conferencing, and then you have the security and governance side of those tools to protect data and access to it. If you're not on the Microsoft system and you're using Google, for example, Google has a core suite of productivity tools, and you would need to, you would want to look to layering on a set of data governance and device management tools to go with that, so that you can have both sides of the coin, the productivity with the security and data governance.
Okay, as we start to come to the end, I have one more. And again, I'll mention that if we didn't get to your question or you have any thoughts or questions just following the webinar, please feel free to reach out to us directly at the email that I put there in the chat. And one more for you, Andy. We are a 30-person or 30-plus company. What would be the best approach to decide which department should go full office or hybrid or remote?
Great question.
You got that?
Yes, I did. Thank you. And I'm going to tack on a piece of advice to the last question too, in terms of evaluating new solutions. That's a great area to use your change team, to have them evaluating on a regular basis the technology you're using now, and if there are gaps in what you're trying to accomplish, how you can use solutions that are coming down the pike as well. One reason that's particularly important, even what you're using now, it will be constantly evolving. Not only the technology itself, but how businesses are taking advantage of it. So having that change team, not just for the pilot process, but for the life of your flexible workplace, will help you stay on top of the technology, stay on top of your organizational needs, and make sure you're using it to bridge the gap wherever you can. And for that last question that you gave, Ryan, I would say that the change team or change committee is the right way to do that. There's no silver bullet, right? You can't write down all the features of a team and quantitatively add up you need this many people online and this many people in the office for this many hours per week. What you need to start with is a pilot program where you're basically testing a hypothesis of what the key stakeholders of the team think would be effective. And then you test that in a pilot program. You have your change team collect feedback and iterate. It's important to use an organizational change team so that as multiple teams and multiple departments do this, they can all benefit from the lessons learned from the others. If we have every team do it independently, we're naturally going to silo those insights into several buckets rather than sharing them.
Great, Andy. Well, we are right at time. I did have a couple additional questions. As I responded to everybody that did send those in, I will get back to you, or Andy will get back to you with the answers to those questions via email, so that those are addressed. And if you'd like to discuss further, again, you can just reach out to us directly and we'd be happy to have further conversation with you. Andy?
Thanks, Ryan. That's it from my perspective. Yeah, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, and yeah, happy to facilitate any conversations as you're working through this and any other challenges you might have.
Great. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day.